Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today's National Google Hangout. My name is Suman Raghunathan. I'm the Executive Director of SALT, South Asian Americans Leading Together. And we're really privileged to be joined today by a whole host of South Asian movement leaders, as well as Chirag Patel, the son of Mr. Sureshbhai Patel, who, as I'm sure folks remember, was brutally beaten at the hands of Madison, Alabama police officers last February. Today, we have called a Google Hangout to make sure that folks in the community are able to get an update on what is the current status of the case, particularly in the wake of 2 mistrials. And we're also here today in response to the groundswell of feedback, outrage, and interest, really, from South Asian community members across the country who were, of course, understandably angry to see the acquittal of Eric Parker, the police officer who beat and brutalized Mr. Sureshbhai Patel during his morning walk over a year ago. As you likely know, this case was heard in a federal district court after the Department of Justice indicted the officer on a criminal charge for the excessive use of force last year, 1 month after the initial incident. The first trial ended in a mistrial last September, and a subsequent appeal ended in yet another mistrial last November. The federal district court judge dismissed the case, leading to yet another acquittal this January. And while there's a pending civil suit and a state misdemeanor case against the officer to be settled, this will likely not occur until 2017. And so this is an important movement-building moment for our communities, not only for us to examine how we can continue to stand up and make our voices heard around police brutality, but for us also to connect the incident of Mr. Sureshbhai Patel's beating to long-standing and historical instances of police brutality and racial profiling that have been experienced by many communities of color, including the Movement for Black Lives, which has been calling our entire nation to action on police accountability and an end to state violence and police violence since the death of Trayvon Martin at the hands of his murderer, George Zimmerman, and Mr. Zimmerman's subsequent acquittal. This is an important moment for our communities to channel our anger and frustration into joining the Movement for Black Lives, as well as speaking to the broader call for police accountability and justice. And for us to talk to our families, mobilize our friends and networks, and continue to be steadfast in our pursuit of justice for all victims of police violence. As I mentioned earlier, we'll be hearing today from Sureshbhai Patel's own son, Chirag, the president of Asha Kiran, a local community-based organization in Huntsville, Alabama, Bhavani Kakani, who collectively mobilized South Asian community members in Alabama to meet with Department of Justice officials about this case, showed up every day to the trials, and has continued to lead cultural competency trainings with first responders in Madison. SALT is very proud also to welcome, in addition, another member of our National Coalition of South Asian Organizations, Fahad Ahmed from DRUM, as well as one of our latest additions to the network of progressive South Asians who are speaking out on this work. And that work has been happening also on the part of the National Queer Asian Pacific American Alliance, as well as other community folks, including Sasha W. We're really pleased to be able to organize today's Google Hangout in partnership with 18 Million and Rising, and certainly want to make a shout out to them for their technical help as well as for getting the word out on this important issue. I'm going to actually now turn over the mic, literally and figuratively, to Chirag Patel for us to be able to get an update on the, not only on the civil suit, but also to hear from Chirag how his family is doing and how Mr. Patel continues to move forward with his rehabilitation after this tragic incident last year. Chirag, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for organizing this Google Hangout and giving a word out there. So first of all, the dad it's been a year. So dad is improved a lot, but still still he has a problem on the left leg. He cannot pick up correctly, and he has a tingling on his hand all the time. So he has a sleep problem due to the nerves damage that is occurred due to that incident. So he is doing best that he can, and he is improving. But we are not looking at 100% recovery, and whatever he has to work every day to keep it. Whatever the life he has left, the work he has to do. As far as the lawsuit goes, my dad's attorney has filed a motion to lift the stay on the lawsuit and go forward with the lawsuit, but a federal judge on the lawsuit has denied that motion, stating that officer or a person who is defendant has a viable Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination. If he comes in the lawsuit case and says something that can be used against him, or he using the Fifth Amendment constitutional right to not to say anything in the lawsuit. So because we have to resolve the criminal case, that was judge saying, resolve the criminal case that is brought by state of Alabama first. And in that case, that judge has announced the retirement. So governor of Alabama has to assign a new judge first, then that case will go forward. So we don't have any timeline at all right now. Everything is hanging up there. There is no update that anybody knows what is going to happen next, because there is no judge in the state case right now.
Chirag, thank you so much for not only joining us, but for also being able to show a little bit just how hard this has been, not only on your father, but also on you and your family. And I know that there are thousands of people nationwide who not only are with you, but who remain committed to supporting you and your family in any way that we possibly can. And so please just know that we're with you, and that you are not alone, and that we remain in your corner and committed to making sure that we can continue to advance what we all need for our communities, which is for us to feel safe in our very own communities, on the streets that we live on and walk every day. And again, I just really want to thank you for joining us today. And I want to, in that spirit, turn the mic over to Bhavani Kakani, the president of Asha Kiran, for us to hear also about the local organizing efforts and blood, sweat, and tears that continues on their part on the ground to make sure that we don't forget about this incident, and that law enforcement is reminded by us in our community-based institutions and organizations of the work that they have to do. Bhavani, please take it away.
Of course. Hello, everyone. And first of all, thank you for participating in this Google Hangout to support not only Mr. Sureshbhai Patel and his family, also brings social justice to our community. First, let me talk about Asha Kiran a little bit. Maybe many of you have looked at the website. Probably you may know about Asha Kiran. You know, Asha Kiran is a very small non-profit 501c3, and it was established in 2006 because of a community need. People like us, the foreign-born, South Asians and other foreign-born, needed somewhere to go. So that's how we started the culturally sensitive services that we, in 2006. Its vision is the one that is really move us forward, it aspires to be a ray of hope towards building a healthy and harmonious community. And its mission is to educate, empathize, and empower persons of South Asian origin and other foreign origins in providing culturally sensitive services, of course, confidential in nature. I want to also say why we were doing this operation only in the beginning because of the lack of language translators and interpreters. As you all know, India itself has 20 languages that are official now, more than 100 dialects. So you can see the enormity of providing the languages, interpreters and translators. And also it works with many of the community cultural venues and also organizations. So we have about 12 endorsements, ranging from Spanish to Indian Association or Pakistani Association or Alabama Association of Physicians, Indian origin physicians. So we try to get a step into our communities so that we can increase the awareness of what's going on. We also have received the Charles Ray Junior Social Justice Award from Interfaith Mission Service. This is to be viewed that we serve all religions, all people, and they had given us for our Kite Festival. What we do is the Kite Festival is for serving for social justice, so they had given us the Social Justice Award in the community. Of course, you all know we are a member of the North Alabama Coalition Against Homelessness and National Coalition of South Asian Organizations, as you all are. And also we are a member of Alabama Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And we may say, can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Okay. We may say that why is she saying this? Because we serve the victims and survivors of violence and also other crises. So we have a shelter, domestic violence shelter, and also a sexual assault and human trafficking shelter that's been in operation from 2012. Okay, let's move on. And we are working at a community level to increase the respect within our communities, not just the tolerance. You can say, how are you doing this? Asha Kiran is not only having events such as Kite Festival, we just finished one in March 5th, where more than 100 nonprofits participated in it, and along with much diverse population. I think Chirag has attended. We had over 6,000 people attend. What we say this Kite Festival is soaring for social justice. And just like the kites, we may be different. We may be different shapes, different colors. We may fly different heights. However, we enjoy the diversity. And we are trying to instill that in our communities, working side by side. And of course, Asha can also collaborate at the community level when it does, whether it is a kite festival or legal screening or any other event. Say, for example, the free health fair or free health screening, we collaborate with 4 other organizations in Huntsville area, such as 100 Black Men, Alabama A&M University, Links, Delta Sorority. So it's not that we just do with one group of people, we do with many. This is mainly to show, for example, when we started the health fair, they did only one prayer, Christian prayer. I asked them, why are they doing that? There's a diverse population here. And then the next year, they were very nice to change it to a common universal prayer. So this is how we try to bring a grassroots change, or at least the awareness in our communities. So going back to some other things, also we do vegetarianism, veganism, healthy habits, as I talked about. And another thing we started was annual cultural competency workshop. We've been doing it for several years now, and we actually focused on South Asian countries, and then Muslims or Islam, and then we also did Latinos. So that is in every year, and we have over 75 or so first responders that come and learn about cultural nuances in those particular areas. And these first responders come from all over Alabama. And in November 2014, we started giving the culturally sensitive trainings to the first responders other than the annual one. The first one was conducted in Huntsville Hospital emergency room. And then we tried to set it up with the Madison police. Now you are seeing why I am going into it now. We are going in, we tried to set it up with the Madison police. It was set for February 19th due to the holidays, Thanksgiving, and Christmas holidays, and also schedule conflicts. However, Sureshbhai Patel's case happened on February 6th. We set it up for February 19th, and we did issue a statement about it, that they had agreed to take the culturally sensitive trainings. However, the Sureshbhai incident was horrific. The statements were given publicly, and they were given in the newsletters. Since then, Asha Kiran had given last year 16 trainings to 482 attendees. Just from January 1st to March last week, it has given 32 trainings and 550 attendees.
Wow.
All the shelters in Alabama do MOUs with us. Department of Human Resources doing MOU with us. Legal Services doing it. Why I am saying this is increasing the awareness that people need to be cognizant of the cultural nuances that exist. However, when we do this, we do say the cultural nuances not only foreign-born and LEP, but also it can exist here, like African American community, or maybe from north to south. But we are saying just be cognizant when you are dealing with LEP or an immigrant population. So this is increasing. The awareness is increasing within Alabama.
Bhavani, thank you so much for that update. I want to make sure we have a packed slate of panelists, and I know that you have so much more to share, and I want to make sure that we can hopefully get to some of that during our Q&A session as well. And again, just want to thank you so much for the tremendous work that you in particular and Asha Kiran have been doing, and that SALT has been lucky to be able to support, in particular to address the issues around language access and how the police can continue to meet the needs of limited English proficient individuals, not only in Madison and in Huntsville, but really nationwide. And so deep, deep thanks for the tremendous reach and work that you all have been doing for so long on the ground in Alabama and in Huntsville and in Madison. With that, I want to actually turn the mic over for us to hear a little bit, not only from our South Asian communities, but also for how South Asian communities can really bridge this work as we continue to think about and support work around police brutality and around justice in the context of the movement for Black Lives, and for us to hear a little bit from folks about the resources that are out there for us to continue to be advancing and really moving the ball forward for all of our communities as we continue to grapple with these really important issues nationwide. And with that, I'm going to turn over the mic to Deepa Iyer for us to hear a little bit about what those resources can look like and what some of the connections and synergies can look like as we continue to move forward. Deepa.
Thanks so much, Simin. So hi, everyone. I'm Deepa Iyer. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for Social Inclusion. And I wanted to again thank SALT and 18 Million Rising for pulling this together. And thank you, Chirag and Bhavani Aunty for sharing as well. So you've heard so far about the case itself, Mr. Patel's case, and the fact that through 2 trials that there was no justice in this case, which is not unusual because most cases involving police violence in this country do not actually receive the recourse that they need from the justice system. But what can we do beyond this particular case? And I know that SALT will keep us apprised of what we can do with the civil suit, but what can we do beyond that? How can we take action beyond the legal parameters of this particular case? And one way in which activists have already been doing that is to make the connections with the broader issues around police brutality and the criminal justice system, and by linking our communities with the movement for Black Lives. So as you all know, the movement for Black Lives has made it very clear and urgent that we cannot take our eyes away from the epidemic of police brutality, which is affecting the lives of communities of color. Studies show that between 2010 and 2012, young Black men were 21 times more likely as whites to be killed by police. The same disproportionate outcomes exist in stops and frisk rates as well as arrest rates. But it's not only Black men, it's also Black women, children, and transgender individuals who are victims of this sort of violence and brutality. The names of Michael Brown, Rekia Boyd, Maya Hall, Sandra Bland, Tamir Rice, and Ayanna Stanley Jones make up just part of the distressingly long list of Black people who have lost their lives in encounters with the police. And so while South Asians do not experience police brutality at the same rates as others, we cannot sit on the sidelines when it comes to dismantling the criminal justice system that exists today. We too, our communities are affected by this system as well in different ways, most significantly via state violence through the domestic war on terror, which includes surveillance, deportations, and interrogations of our communities. So the case of Mr. Patel, many have said, offers South Asians an opportunity, if we haven't yet, to become more deeply engaged in the fight for justice, as articulated by the Movement for Black Lives. It's first an opportunity for us to understand in a deeper manner what are the issues with the criminal justice system as they relate to people of color. Secondly, how do we express our solidarity and support for the actions and efforts undertaken by Black activists and organizers? And thirdly, how can we be better engaged and involved in addressing anti-Black racism that permeates our own community? The set of anti-Black perceptions and stereotypes that some South Asians perpetuate, ending up in the creation of wedges between safety and Black communities. So we have 3 community activists who are going to help flesh out these 3 questions further and talk about some of the resources that are available for our communities today. First, Purvi Shah from the Center for Constitutional Rights, who's been very engaged with bridging some of the work in the Movement for Black Lives to the legal community, is going to talk a little bit about what we need to know as South Asians about the Movement for Black Lives. And after her, Fahad Ahmed from Drum will talk about how South Asians are supporting and can support organizing efforts. And then Sasha from NCAPIA will round this out by describing an effort to address anti-Black racism within South Asian communities, which is a tremendous resource for all of us. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Purvi, to start us off.
Thanks, Deepa, and thanks so much to 18 Million Rising and SALT for putting this together and for everybody that's on the video call today. I wanted to just start off by sort of honoring and recognizing that a lot of the resistance that we've seen in the Movement for Black Lives over the last year and a half started from people very similar to Chirag, who were simply sort of resisting and organizing around what happened to one of their family members. You know, if we look at the beginning of the Movement for Black Lives, or if we see one of the origin stories of it being the resistance in Ferguson, a lot of what was happening there was the family and the community were refused to sort of accept what was happening to one of their family members, like, sort of grieving the loss of one of their children. And over the last year and a half, we've seen sort of an enormous groundswell and a movement growing across our country. And I think one of the first things that's really helpful for us as people that are certainly impacted by police violence, as we can tell by the story of Sureshbhai Patel, but and other forms of police violence that we experience in our community, is if we're partnering with this movement. I mean, one of the important things that I think is happening within this moment is that people are really asking for transformational change. You know, over history, the idea of police violence, of racially motivated police violence, is not new to people in our community. It's not new certainly to people in the Black community. But I think the opportunity and the aspiration of this movement is to really seek radical reforms. So to get at the root of many of these problems and start looking for policy shifts that can actually get at transformational change. And certainly meaning that also means looking at ways that we can sort of address this epidemic of police violence, of state-sanctioned violence against our communities through local campaign fights and through national ones, and getting at the root of the causes of anti-Black racism. And I guess the other thing that would be important to mention is, like, I think for folks, many of you may have marched in the streets or have participated in local actions or even online actions or national ones, and the sort of origin or spark that brought many of us to this issue might have been an individual situation, or whether it was Rakia Boyd or what happened to Sureshbhai Patel. And so this issue of police violence is really what started us on the path, but I think this movement is very intentionally moving beyond just the issue of police violence, and it's looking at the sum total of inequality in our communities, from jobs to housing to education to healthcare, and the way policing interacts and surrounds all of those experiences. So I wanted to mention a couple of specific sort of overarching policy goals of the Movement for Black Lives. Particularly one is the idea of divesting from racist policing systems and investing in communities. And particularly for the Movement for Black Lives has been looking at investing in Black communities. And so this is really sort of examining this contradiction or this paradigm that there aren't, the resources that we have when we talk about safety go towards policing, and that there are many economic incentives at the local level and at the national level to expand policing, and for many of us, we believe that policing, and for many folks in the Movement for Black Lives believe that policing and police as a whole, it's not sort of one or two bad apples. It's been the racism pervades the entire system of policing, the incentives behind it, the policies, the hierarchies, and so that it isn't simply enough to seek justice in one particular instance. It's to try to get at the root of what is racist in policing. And so then the demand is to not just diminish policing and to diminish the sort of militarization of our police, the increasing surveillance and harassment tactics of police, the racially discriminatory stops and frisks that police use, but is to turn around and use the resources and dollars that are going towards caging incarceration and policing, and to now reinvest them in our communities toward actual jobs and healthcare and housing and many of the things that allow communities to fully thrive. So the idea is not just for people to survive, but to really have full capacity to thrive in life and flourish. The second main piece of what policies, and this is all going to be playing out differently in different local contexts, has been community control. So the idea of re-engaging in the idea of a democratic process in our country, but really looking at how do we democratize control over many of our social systems. So whether it, particularly policing, looking at civilian oversight of the police, the ability to hold police officers accountable through oversight for any actions, the ability to have actual teeth to civilian oversight, so that it's not just sort of sort of rubber stamping or, really sort of oversight without any possibility for accountability. So those two, and that accountability is not just on police officers, but also looking at elected officials that have condoned police violence or have not taken action to remedy racist policing, but also looking at district attorneys. And we're seeing a lot of this come to a head right now. If we look at what's been happening in Chicago with the recent actions against the district attorney there, we look at what's been happening in Ferguson and St. Louis more broadly since the uprisings there. So those are two major kind of policy points that I would raise. I think before I turn it over to the next person, I wanted to mention, a lot of what is happening around the Movement for Black Lives is going to unfold at the local level. And so what's really important is for us to think about how do we engage in these local fights. And I know Fahad is going to talk a little bit more about that, but I thought I would offer maybe 3 key points that would help us think about how we could get engaged in these local fights. The first would be, is to start to investigate which are the organizations that are working towards, that are a part of the Movement for Black Lives in your local region, that are working on policing, police violence, or racial profiling. and to meet with them before crisis in our community or crisis in their community to build authentic relationships. One of the main pieces that will be really relevant in this moment is not bootstrapping our issues onto the issues of the Black community, is to really try to find and develop an analysis that helps us understand how oppression in our community is actually interrelated to oppression in the Black community. And I think the beginning piece of that is building real relationships. The second piece would be to engage in real discussions inside our community, outside of our community, with Black communities, with brown communities, around why does the world look the way that it looks? What is the history of policing in America? How has policing and racism pervaded a variety of systems in our country? What are the myths that we've been told about freedom and democracy in our country? And, you know, our lived realities tell us that what we're being told about how police keep us safe and how justice sort of unfolds are not true. So we need to have more of that discussion and dialogue. And the third thing is to start gathering to really radically imagine how our world could look different. You know, it may be a scary question to ask, what would it look like if we did not have police? What would it look like if if instead of having incarceration or police or guns, we dealt with conflict in other ways in our communities? Very complicated things like domestic violence, like how would we deal with those things if we did not cede those over to the police? And then the last thing would be to just sort of engage meaningfully in local fights. And so that means building, and I think Fahad will talk more about that. But I just sort of wanted to lay out some of those initial thoughts as for how we could meaningfully, in a sort of really authentic way, build with the movement for Black Lives.
Thanks so much, Corby, and that was so helpful to hear you talk about some of the issues that we need to be mindful of, being part of the transformative aspects of a racial justice movement that is not just about policing, as you said, but about the some inequality that affects the lives of communities of color, including people who are of South Asian background and descent, and asking those hard questions about the type of communities that we want to live in. So with that, I'm going to move over to Fahad Ahmed from DRUM in New York City, who has been the organization that has been working on issues affecting South Asian communities in Queens and beyond. So turning it over to you, Fahad, for your piece on this.
Thank you. My name is Fahad Ahmed. I am the director of an organization called DRUM, Desis Rising Up and Moving. We organize working class South Asian immigrants, workers, and youth in New York City. What I wanted to talk about was a little bit of our own work. I think, as it's been mentioned before, a lot of these issues around police violence that we see, the incident that happened with Brother Patel, these are issues that do impact our communities, and particularly working class segments of our communities. So in New York City, stop and frisk has been a major issue in neighborhoods such as Jamaica and Jackson Heights, Queens, both of which have large South Asian populations. And so we've had young people that have been stopped and frisked by the time they're 12 years old, that have been stopped and frisked anywhere from 12, 20, 60, and up to 80 times by the time they're 21 years old. We also find that the surveillance of largely Muslim communities has played out most heavily in working class communities, whether it's in houses of worship, whether it's in workplaces, religious bookstores, but places that are geographically within the working class segments of our communities and not in more affluent neighborhoods or affluent suburbs of the city. And then there's the daily police harassment that people face as workers, low-wage workers, as cab drivers, as street vendors, as restaurant workers, which also impacts our communities a lot. And so for us, we start from these lived experiences of people to start to engage them around what are solutions that we can find to the problems that our own communities face. But but at the same time, how do we understand our struggles in relation to and then solidarity with other communities? And so I think two things when we think about solidarity is, I think it's a very often used word, but for us solidarity has some very particular factors that we have to consider. One is solidarity across whom, and the second is solidarity how. And I think the first idea around solidarity across whom really focuses on where is it that the contradictions across our communities lie. And it's often not so much at the places where college students and activists are often engaged in similar conversations, but they actually exist in those parts of our communities that are both directly impacted and are marginalized. And so for us, that solidarity building has to happen across those parts of our communities. And for us, that takes on two components: doing very intentional political education with our own membership, our own base in our own communities, around the history of colonialism, around the history of police, around the history of white supremacy and anti-black racism. Anti-black racism both in America, but also historically within our communities and our home countries. And then secondly, actually building relationships across impacted people. And so what does it mean when a South Asian youth that's been stopped and frisked 40 times or 60 times is hanging out with Black and Latino youth that have been stopped and frisked 80 times or 100 times by the time they're 21 years old? And they build relationships with each other, and they start to understand each other's struggles and each other's communities. What happens when those same Black and Latino youth then start turning out because they know this youth, start turning out for issues around surveillance, even though it doesn't impact their communities, but because they know people that have been impacted by surveillance, they have a personal bond and a personal relationship. What happens when Muslim mothers that have their loved ones or their children locked away serving 20 or 30 years in prison start turning out for Black and Latina mothers who have lost their children to police violence and police brutality? And that it's through these relationships that we start to see a transformative effect take place. And so that's the second component of solidarity building is the how. What does the real solidarity look like? Is the solidarity saying, I stand in solidarity with you? Is the solidarity just showing up to each other's actions, each other's events? And I think the way that we've started to interpret it as solidarity actually starts to be demonstrated when people start to reshape their own struggles and their own demands. And so when South Asian youth that face a lot of bullying and harassment, not only from security agents, but also from teachers and also from fellow students in schools, when they shift from asking for, how do we retrain people, how do we do sensitivity training, to actually saying, no, how do we get rid of police that create this environment of mistrust and competition across communities? How do we invest in restorative justice programs that actually start to build and deepen the sense of community bonds within the school community? Very much harking back to Purvi's early point about defunding the police and investing in community. And so this becomes a demand that actually allows us to resolve the contradictions that exist in our communities, across our communities, and start to envision a world in which there's liberation for all of our communities. I think just the last thing I had
left.
What was that?
You have about less than a minute left to wrap up.
Okay. I think just the last point I would say is really recognizing the root problems of these problems, that it actually is rooted in the systems itself. In New York City, if you talk to a lot of our youth, the times that they were stopped and frisked, by and large they were stopped and frisked by other South Asian officers. When we talk about surveillance, it is Muslim undercover officers and Muslim informants and South Asian informants that have targeted people in our community, have been trapped people in our community, and now we have people from our community serving long sentences. And so how do we start to get to have a deeper understanding of the problems in society and come up with solutions that don't only solve the symptoms of the problem, but actually the root causes of those issues?
Thank you, Fahad. And the two, you made so many important points, and the two that I just wanted to lift up in what you said. One, around the shared interests that South Asian communities have when we're looking at the criminal justice system or issues of policing, and how South Asian and particularly Muslim communities in the decade and a half since 9/11 have not been immune to state violence. And the second point you made around solidarity across whom you asked and how. And I feel like what you were getting to is this concept that I've been hearing others talk about around co-liberation. What does co-liberation look like in terms of addressing, as you and Purvi both said, the root causes of injustice? So with that kind of framework in mind that Purvi and Fahad set up, I want to turn it over to Sasha from Incapia, who is also with an organization called API Resistance, and she can talk a little bit, Sasha can talk a little bit about how we do this in the context of specifically addressing anti-Black racism within our communities, within South Asian communities in particular, and also direct people to a resource that you might find useful. Sasha?
Sure. Hey everybody, just want to echo again, thanks so much to 18 Million Rising and to SALT and to all of the panelists on this call. I'm going to keep it short because I think y'all have said most of what needs to be said thus far, and I'm really honored to be on here with you. So my name is Sasha W. I am the organizing director at the National Queer Asian Pacific Islander Alliance and also part of the Queer South Asian National Network. And I think that there's, what Fahad was getting at to the end, I think is what I wanted to talk about a little bit more, that that our communities do have an investment in undoing policing, absolutely do experience policing and surveillance in many ways, and that we need to tap in to that shared investment, but also that often our communities, especially those of us, myself included, who grew up middle class or upper middle class, can use that class privilege to hide what that investment looks like, right? And can actually do have a lot of investment in upholding white supremacy and upholding policing, and in not being part of the movement for Black lives. Like, we have a very real investment in sort of not doing this movement work and in moving instead towards upholding white supremacy. I think that that's an area that those of us who do have that experience really need to be working on challenging, right? How do we approach people who have typically used their class privilege to shield themselves from violence, or their communities from violence, and actually ask, what is your investment? How do we shift these narratives? How do we shift your approach and our own anti-Black racism, right? Internalizing ourselves and our communities. And I think there's both, like, that's both worth thinking about for those of us who are organizing in community spaces, what that looks like in those organizing spaces when we do South Asian or API organizing. Who do we actually bring into the center, and how does it shift our work if we bring working class South Asian people into the center of these conversations, if we bring queer and trans South Asian folks into the center of these conversations, right? If API doesn't just mean East Asian, it shifts what narratives we tell about our communities and our communities' investments. And then on an individual level, I think actually having these hard conversations with our families and starting to do that on a larger scale is actually important, right? Because we know that people in our families, our officers, our informants, work for TSA, right? Like our people hold these jobs and hold these positions and hold power in really important ways, or our elected officials, right? Are people who hold power in different ways, and if we have access to that power, we need to leverage it. And so with API Resistance, which is a group in DC of API folks organizing in solidarity with the Movement for Black Lives, we did a project called Bringing It Home, and we asked 5 South Asian people who are involved in organizing to actually talk to their families and to begin to have these conversations. And I think I also want to say that it's not, I mean, the folks that ended up doing this were mostly, I think, probably in their 20s or 30s talking to parents, right? And it's not like that conversation happens one way, that younger folks like have the answers and that our parents are somehow like less educated or less aware, right? That's how it played out in this project. I think that, I mean, as folks on this call, right, as we see, like, that is not actually always true, sorry. But still so with that in mind, right, I think that looking at that research is a way to just sort of see how some of these conversations play out and what themes came out. So there were a lot of themes that came out around police and policing, and the ways that even in upper middle class communities, the police sometimes make us feel unsafe, but we don't always translate that to wanting to dismantle policing, right? Because again, there's this tension between both being impacted and having investment in upholding white supremacy. We talked about the ways that people have internalized racism, or that sort of came out in these interviews. And the ways that people have internalized racism, that our families have internalized racism, and the ways that our families have fears around safety and around getting involved in movement work, which comes a lot, I think, from the political context that many people come from, where doing political work is very scary and dangerous, although that is also true here. And so I think that's a resource and a way of, that series of interviews, I think, is a way of thinking about how we actually bring this work home to our families when it's safe to do so, and how we bring that work home in very specific and meaningful ways that are connected to larger change. So I will just leave it with sort of echoing some things that have already been said. So yeah, I think there's one side of looking internally, building having these conversations in our own communities with ourselves in our community spaces, whether it's conversations with family members or having workshops in our own community spaces, lifting up the voices in our communities that are often marginalized and that actually often have this more deeper shared connection and investment with the movement for Black lives. And lastly, thinking about the privilege and the resources that we have access to and how we actually leverage those to support these ongoing movements.
Great. Thank you so much, Sasha, and thanks for really unpacking that notion of privilege and how it often shields and prevents our communities from engaging, and that this is an opportunity for people to have those hard conversations with their families. And I wanted to also note that if you're on Twitter, SALT has been tweeting resources, including the one that Sasha mentioned out there, and posting that on Facebook as well, so that folks have that in hand. So before I turn it back over to Simon, I just wanted to thank Purvi and Fahad and Sasha for giving us a real landscape in terms of what the issues are, the broader issues, the root causes that we're talking about when we're talking about criminal justice and policing, how South Asian communities also have shared interest in understanding, becoming aware, and addressing these issues from a systemic standpoint, and lastly, what we can be doing to disrupt the narratives that we build within our own communities around these issues as well. So Simon, turning it back over to you for the next part.
Sure. Thank you so much, Deepa, Purvi, Fahad, and Sasha. Before we go into Q&A, I want to actually take us back to the essence of the conversation. And Sasha, you mentioned this already. This is about family. This is about having these important conversations in our families so that folks like Chirag and countless others never have to experience what they have at the community, at the local level. And SALT, for one, as many others on today's Hangout as well as nationwide, is not only committed to continuing to make sure we can have these important conversations with our families, but is also committed to calling for justice, as I know you all are. We will continue to send out information and resources so that folks can stay up to date on the case itself. And we are going to continue to work with Asha Kiran, with Chirag, and with other folks at the local level for us to ensure that the thousands of community voices, South Asian communities, community members across the country are really able to stay engaged in this conversation on a day-to-day basis to make sure that they can continue to make their voices heard in support of Chirag, his father, and his family, but to also make sure that we are raising our voices at the national level and in a national conversation to really continue to call for police accountability and to speak out against police brutality, to make sure that no other person, when they're either walking in their own neighborhood and in their own community or are going about their daily life on the streets, have to deal with police brutality, racial profiling, and day-to-day violence that no human being should have to ever confront on a day-to-day basis. And so with that, I want to open it up to Q&A, and to make sure that folks know that SALT, as well as other folks on today's Google Hangout, will continue to make sure that we send resources and that we will be following up with a national call to action in the coming weeks as the case continues to develop and as we continue to be connected to the larger struggle to end violence against not only our communities but against communities of color as a whole. So I think we would love to be able to hear from Chirag in closing before we go to Q&A. And so Chirag, if there's anything that you want to share with us before we go and take questions from the audience, please, we're here.
So I would like to just, I really appreciate all of you who has joined, and Salt and Deepa, and Asha Kiran has helped a lot in this tough time of my dad and the family. So I really appreciate all of you doing this.
As I said, you are not alone, and there are thousands of people behind you nationwide.
Thank you.
So questions, definitely please send us questions via Facebook, and Chirag, you know, one of the questions that we've already gotten from folks in the virtual audience across the nation are what can folks do to continue helping you and your father? Please let folks know how they can continue to be there and to show support for you.
As far as right now, my dad is going through a physical therapy, and he just needs a lot of emotional support. He is in a good spirit. So we are working on it. As the case develops, I will know the more needs. So as of right now, he is okay, and I'm standing right beside him all the time.
Thanks, Chirag. We can definitely make sure that we can provide updates from you to folks nationwide as well as the case continues to develop and you have more clarity on how folks can continue to help.
Thank you.
I guess our next question is for all of our panelists, really, and this is from one of our community members. What strategies have actually worked to move upper and middle class South Asians? And as a follow-up, how can we concretely continue to support families such as Chirag's and many others nationwide? If folks have any sense of what strategies have been able to work in the past around really engaging upper and owning class as well as middle class South Asians in fights for police brutality, fights against police brutality and for police accountability.
I can start, if that works, or Sasha, it would be great to have you follow up. I just wanted to say that I think that this particular case seems like it has opened a real window in terms of opening the eyes of many South Asians of upper and middle class backgrounds. And there has been something about this case, which, horrific as it is, with the video that people were able to see, which I think opened the eyes of people to say, this can happen to us too. And I do think that sometimes that piece of, this is also my fight, this could happen to my grandfather, it could happen to my brother, it could happen to my family member, is sometimes what people need in order to spark their awareness, to open their eyes, and then to take action. So I think that that's why it has been important, tragic as it is, that this even occurred. But it has been important for activists like Sasha and others around the country to be able to bring this to the attention of more people in the community. Another way has been the use of ethnic media. I've seen that a lot of ethnic media has covered this particular incident, followed it through the trials, for example, as well. Workshops that community members are doing, not just those hard conversations, but actual workshops to raise the facts of what happened, talking about the injustice, making the connections that Fahad talked about to our own communities. Those three strategies are ones that seem to be working to open the eyes of more South Asian communities who are privileged and who might be getting engaged in the broader fight. Sasha, please go ahead with your.
Sure. I would echo a lot of that and share just personally, I think what's worked in talking with my own family has really been asking, like, can you imagine this? Imagine this happening to someone that you know. Can you imagine this happening to your son, right? And I've written about that a little bit. Like, that's been a very real conversation with my mother, and that's without claiming that someone who looks like me is as likely, anywhere near as likely, to be impacted by police violence as any Black person that we know, right? But it's still making those connections. It's really asking, like, what is your investment in this? And I think a lot of that has really come from conversations, and that's part of what the Bringing It Home project was based in, was really having those conversations and having them in a way that weren't sort of from like a social justice language or without lecturing, but really asking, like, what have your experiences been with police? What happens when you go to an airport, right? What do you experience in your life that makes you afraid that actually comes from state institutions? And how do we begin to shift this idea of we're afraid of Black communities, we're afraid of Latino communities, we're afraid of immigrants, right, to what fear do you experience from the state, and how do we then make those connections? And so a lot of what I've seen that has worked with friends and even personally has been really asking those questions and having the patience to let those answers be slow, to let those conversations be a little bit slow, to take the time to really build, and not pretend that we're going to shift years of hearing racism, of seeing the media, right, of like being part of this country overnight. So again, a lot of just asking questions and having those conversations again and again, and eventually moving that towards asking for resource shift. So again, just personally, I had a lot of conversations with my mother when I was in Madison and when Tony Robinson was killed. And in the amount, like, by that talking, right, my parents ended up donating to local work happening in Madison. And that was a really big shift. That's something that wouldn't have happened even 5 years ago. And so, yeah, I think a lot of really slow, patient conversations that we actually have the access to have.
Thanks, Sasha. We also have
Do you mind if I add something to that?
Go ahead, Purvi, please.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say that, you know, I think the other thing is like, it really, to me, goes back to what Fahad said, which was about building real relationships. You know, it's like, my experience is that when people have a chance to talk to somebody who's been stop and frisked 80 times in their life, that impacts us. When we tap into our empathy, I think the sort of othering of Black communities from our community, the fact that we, for a variety of reasons, our communities at times have been insular. You know, I think we have to do the work to get ourselves into other spaces, physically into other communities, you know, where we can have real conversation. I think in some ways, the relationships and the empathy that comes from actually listening to the real life stories of what people have gone through. And I think we can't, you know, it's not just simply empathy. I think it's what Sasha was saying before too, which is analysis. You know, it's like we have to engage in the political discussion, maybe, you know, in slow ways and in familial ways, but also to really start encouraging members of our community to start challenging the mythology that we've been told about why we succeed in this country or why we can succeed in this country versus why other people have been systematically marginalized. And so I think it's sort of breaking apart those systems. I just wanted to add that I thought that the human story and the human relationship piece is probably one of the most valuable ways and easiest ways to move through this.
Thanks, Purvi.
Yeah. I also like to say, like, when somebody feels that something bad happened to them, either it is not nothing happened to the person, but if he is illegally stopped or anything, we need to report each and every incident. That will stay in the file. And when something happens to that other person, that report will help. that person that he has a characterization of doing that, even though he didn't hurt the last person, but he did in the next one.
Chirag, thank you so much for actually raising that point of how important it is and how there may be more opportunities, frankly, for middle and owning class South Asians to actually report incidents locally, either to the police department or to other community-based organizations, or even to SALT, of times when they believe and feel that they have been illegally stopped or racially profiled. You know, I think what's really important for all of our individuals and all of our community members is to continue to do exactly what Chirag shared, which is to speak up. You know, Chirag, one of the questions that we have also had from folks in the Google Hangout and in the audience is if there are additional fundraising efforts to support the continued legal case and or your father's recovery. If you can share anything, or if you'd like to share anything around how folks can continue to materially help. Well,
as of right now, we are just on the hold, and we are just doing the physical therapy right now. So there is a possibility that he has a fusion has been done, and it can get worse anytime, and we have to admit it or anything. So it's very uncertain to say that let's do the fundraising. As of right now, we are just waiting for the civil case to be resolved and see after that.
Right. Chirag, I also wonder if you have, you know, any reflections that you want to share with us after your experience going through these two very challenging trials, in particular around your experience. Before we go to the next question, your experience and any reflections you have around the challenges that your father, as someone who was limited English proficient and who had limited English skills, had when he was interacting or intersecting with the police. And I pose that question, of course, in the context of the national anti-immigrant conversation that unfortunately continues to unfold, and the challenges that many other immigrant communities have continue to have when interacting with police, particularly when folks are less comfortable interacting with police in English. And so if there's any reflections that you have from the trial itself, please share with us before we go to the next question.
Yeah. So my research shows that whenever police stops you, and if you are an immigrant or just visiting, or you know, a lot of people comes for just to go to the Florida, right? So if you are visiting, if police stops you, just tell them you don't know English. And this is my research source from the Department of State. They recommend you, if you don't know English, just tell them you don't know English. And and that is what my father did.
Of course.
So, and then after, due to you have no English, you're not going to be able to further communicate with them. So, I think you know, immigrants, what immigration system has recommended to us, we supposed to do that. Like, just tell them no English, and if it is escalates, you know. It is not supposed to escalate at all. All the police officers should have a training how to handle a non-English speaking person. And let me just go to the broader way. And broader way. What if the person, regardless of a color, is deaf? There is no or mute. Let me just say this: my son. He is growing up. He is delayed in the speaking. He's not speaking yet. So what language he's supposed to speak? So that means that anybody can come and you know, assault. There is no way, right? They just have to. If a person who is mute or deaf, they just have to tell them that he is mute. And we need to, I think, focus more on how they're training, all the officers to handle all this kind of cases, and which is most of the effect goes to the immigrant people.
Sure. Thank you so much. I want to, have Deepa share a little bit more context around the challenges that many limited English proficient immigrants have continued to face for decades, really, when seeking to interact with law enforcement, the very people who are tasked with keeping our communities safe. So Deepa, if you can share a little bit more about some background or provide folks with some background on some issues around limited English proficiency and how that intersects with the police.
Yeah, really quickly, I just wanted to buttress a little bit of what Chirag talked about. In both of these cases around Mr. Patel, there were 2 mistrials, as we heard. And in both of them, really, the jury ended up saying that Mr. Patel did not comply with the law of the police officer's instructions, right? But the bottom line here, as Chirag has said, is that Mr. Patel was not proficient in English. Later on in one of the trials, Mr. Patel testified through an interpreter to say that he was a farmer back in Gujarat. He did not make it past 5th grade, that he did not speak English well, and he didn't understand what was going on. And the bottom line is that any time a police officer or law enforcement agency officer understands that a particular person does not speak English, and it was clear in this case, if you saw the video, if you read the transcript, because all Mr. Patel could say in response to the questions was India, right? So he did not understand, it was clear. But at that moment, what the police officer should have done is abide by his obligations under the Civil Rights Act, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which basically says that you have to provide language access to people who do not speak English. And so in this case, the police officer could have placed a call to a language line, could have thought about the training that groups like Asha Kiran and others have done for police officers and law enforcement, but did not, fail to do that in this case. And as Simon mentioned earlier when she asked the question, if you look at the transcripts from these trials, what you will find time and again is exactly what Simon said: anti-immigrant language. That to me looks like what was really on trial was not the police officer's conduct. What was really on trial was the immigration status and the limited English proficiency of Mr. Patel. And I think we should pay attention to the larger questions that are raised here in terms of our changing racial landscape, around the changing needs of communities, as Bhavni Auntie said earlier, and how that played into the way in which the jury responded to this case as well.
Thanks, Deepa. We have a couple of really important questions from the audience, and so the first that folks have been asking is what we've been talking a lot about conversations and important conversations with our parents and with our families and in our communities, but some folks are wondering about what folks can do to be able to move large South Asian or Desi communities or organizations in the direction of today. And so if any of our panelists, Fahad, Sasha, Purvi, want to speak to very briefly what it can take for us to move large Desi communities in this direction, that would be great. And to piggyback on that, if folks, both Sasha and Fahad perhaps, can speak to specific or tangible initiatives or campaigns that speak to the reinvestment in communities that Purvi mentioned. So first, what does it take for us to move large Desi communities and organizations in the right direction?
So I think I think talking to parents, talking to family members is important, but I think we can. It can be dangerous if that becomes the horizon, both either the starting point or the horizon for the conversations we need to have. Mm-hmm. And so I think the question gets at sort of how do we engage our communities broadly, I think any time that there are large concentrations of our communities, I think there are going to be lived experiences that that people are experiencing, as Sasha talked about, manifestations of state violence, of police misconduct, that, or other systemic forms of state violence that we can delve into. And so it's really sort of feeling out, getting to know people in the community, figuring out what are the things that resonate. And so I'll use a couple of examples linking this to the other question around issues of divestment and investment in communities. The issues of bullying have been very prominent in South Asian communities. That's something, whether you are talking about upper middle class communities to working class communities. For young people in schools, it's been a major issue. It's an issue that's been taken on in a lot of advocacy efforts. But for many years, the primary response had been, we need to stop the bullying, and we need to have zero tolerance for bullying. And what that meant was that South Asian, and even some LGBTQ organizations ended up advocating for more zero tolerance policies, for more police in schools, for higher suspensions for issues of bullying. And what we've been doing is really building out the work around, again, through building political education around state violence and through relationship building across communities and even within our communities, is that our youths that are organizing for educational justice are joining the call to push police out of schools and pushing for investment in restorative justice programs as solutions to forms of bullying, and also saying that bullying doesn't just happen across students, but is actually a reflection of what's happening systematically inside of schools. Similarly, a lot of these similar dynamics play out a lot of times around issues of hate crimes. Obviously, hate crimes legislations come from a particular history and have importance, but also trying to facilitate conversations where tensions do exist across communities that are themselves marginalized. How do we start to build relationships and ask for investment in economic needs in those communities, in health needs in those communities, around educational needs in those communities, which can lessen those tensions and also provide avenues for people to build together. There's other similar campaigns around surveillance, around policing, around immigration, but those are two more concrete examples that we are currently working on.
Thanks, Fahad. Sasha, I think you wanted to also speak to some concrete local and or national campaigns that might be actually helpful in terms of engaging large Desi communities.
Sure. So as I mentioned, I work with the National Queer Asian Pacific Islander Alliance, and a campaign that we've sort of recently launched and have been working on that picks up on a lot of the threads that I think SALT has been working on and other folks have been working on for years is around the Department of Homeland Security and the types of profiling that come through that agency and the ways that manifest locally in our communities. So in May, we've actually been planning a week of action led by queer and trans API people to begin to actually highlight what that profiling looks like in our communities and continue to push back against it. So we're organizing these speak outs in about 8 different cities across the country, where queer API folks are, again, testifying to what this profiling looks like in our communities, in our daily lives, and then pushing back around what that looks like at a national level, right? How we actually build power against DHS, which is actually only 15 years old. And so I think just getting at sort of part of this question, I think, is also like how are we actually engaging, and this is, I think, exactly what Fahad was saying, engaging our communities in these conversations, even if it's not the specific angle of how are we addressing anti-blackness, right? Like, of course, that has to be part of it. That always should be part of these conversations. But also, how are we talking to our communities at large about what these issues look like in our daily lives, and using that as a way to organize and to move forward, and to move beyond just conversations with our parents, but to really organize for structural transformation, for actually reinvesting resources away from national security and from policing and from all of these sort of systems of state violence and back into our communities.
Thanks, Sasha. Purvi, really briefly, go ahead.
I think the other thing I wanted to mention was that I think there's also a really important role for us to work towards Black liberation itself, right? I mean, organizing around racial profiling and policing in our community and drawing connections is one thing, but actually dedicating ourselves to the fight for Black liberation itself seems to be a really important thing for us to do. And if we look at history, we look at the movement for a free South Africa, you know, people of Indian descent were in that fight primarily addressing the contradiction of racism against black people and oppression and economic oppression. So I just wanted to put that out there, that along with finding the interconnections, I think that we have to be not create any safe haven for anti-black racism in our organizations, whatever type of work we do, whether you're a doctor or a lawyer. You know, we started Law for Black Lives, which was multiracially started, but it was focused around this idea that what is the role of anyone in the legal sector to support the fight for Black Lives Matter. So I think we all have to examine the institutions we're a part of and push aggressively and militantly for a conversation around, you know, answering this question of what does it mean for Black Lives Matter.
Thanks, Purvi. I know that we are rapidly running out of time. There is one question that I just want to really quickly, briefly get to, where Manav Thakur asked, in brief, what organizing is already happening to link together South Asian racial justice activists interested in long-term movement building to address and disrupt anti-black racism. And the first thing that I have to say is Google Hangouts like today. And all the folks who are engaged in long-term work that SALT, 18 Million Rising, and many others is really committed to continuing to lift up. I want to remind folks that today's Google Hangout is not the first or the only, and we would love to be able to continue having conversations like today so that we can continue to be engaged in a broader effort against police brutality, racial profiling, and toward police accountability. And so SALT is committed, along with many other folks on today's Google Hangout, to not only continuing to send out resources so that folks can remain engaged, not only in the case itself, but in broader movement building conversations, and for us to make sure that we can continue sharing resources. And so I just want to remind folks that today is not the only or the last conversation that we will be having on these really important and weighty topics. And as we end, if we can actually maybe have our panelists just give us 30 seconds on one concrete action that they think folks on today's call or in general can take as we continue to move toward and in the direction of building not only hope but also strength in our communities to continue to stand up and against violence that no one should ever have to experience the way that Mr. Patel and countless other black, brown men and women have experienced on a day-to-day basis. So just 30 seconds from folks around what folks and individuals can do to continue to move toward hope and strength in the face of the really challenging dynamics that we've spent today speaking about. I'll start off. How about that? So for me, what's most hopeful about, and as we continue to work toward, is the idea that our communities and our community members have a voice and are committed to remaining engaged in struggles for justice for Mr. Patel, as well as for countless other individuals who have been the victim of violence, police violence, state violence, and racial profiling. And so for me, I just continue to be inspired and reminded of how important it is for us to be in conversation with you all, not only in SALT, but as South Asians nationwide, as the nation's most rapidly growing demographic group. And so for me, I just remain committed to continuing the conversation with you all. Who's next? 30 seconds.
I can go next, Simon. Really briefly, this is Deepa. I just wanted to really lift up again the importance of us supporting the work of local organizations in our communities, whether they're groups like Drum or whether they're groups like Asha Kiran in Alabama. And it's very hard to work in the South. It's different on the coast. It is hard to work in the South with limited resources. Asha Kiran is one of the only groups in the South that exists that works in South Asian communities. So to the extent that we can support organizations like theirs and the work that they do, Bhavni Auntie and others are a group of aunties that are holding it up for us in the South. And so I want to lift that up and pack the court when the civil case comes up, if you live in the South especially, to show that these issues are important to you.
Thanks, Deepa.
This is Fahad from Drum. I think it's always good to go deep into our communities, understanding that communities can be defined in multiple ways, but whatever communities you identify with, going deep into communities and working with people that are struggling with real issues. And to me, that's always the starting point around dealing the real impacts and the real oppression that people face, and supporting them and working with them for those people, and sometimes that's us, around the struggles that they face. And through that fight, we begin to really develop and build out the relationships and the linkages across movements. Organize, organize, organize.
Thanks, Fahad.
I can go. This is Purvi. I would say the most inspiring thing to me is the actions taking place by young people resisting what's happening in their communities, in streets of Ferguson, Baltimore, New York City, everywhere. Young people are awake, and we're having a different conversation about race than we've ever had in this country. The fact that Black and brown people are starting to have very honest dialogues about the way we perpetuate oppression within our communities, but also starting to have really honest conversations around how our fates are intertwined. So I think this is an incredibly hopeful moment for actually creating real justice and equality in our societies, and it starts with many of the actions that many of you have been taking across the country.
Thanks, Purvi.
I would like to say that this is Bhavani Kakani with Asha Kiran. We divide ourselves into sections. Whether if you come from India, we'll say we're a south or north or east or west. Somehow, as a human tendency, we try to divide ourselves rather than uniting. Whether it is a South Asian or a Spanish or Latino or some other country, all marginalized persons or individuals or groups need to get together, have a discussion of what's going on within our communities, so that we can strategize and come as together. It is not an individual situation. I know it is very hard when Sureshbhai Patel's situation comes along, which is horrific, but that should unite us. All the immigrants, all the marginalized individuals, have a dialogue, have a forums, have workshops, so that community knows and we can stand, all of us stand together, because this is not one situation, this is not one country, this is all. When we have that dialogue, we open up to the total community, we will have a much more effect on the long run rather than dividing. That is much more inspiring to me. And also, we need to move with the community also, within our communities, not just the section.
So eloquently put, Bhavani Auntie. Sasha. And I'm going to end with Chirag, if that's okay.
That's okay.
Sure. I'm absolutely taking hope from the ways that we are making connections across different experiences, figuring out and continuously figuring out what the investment is of South Asian folks in becoming involved in and supporting the movement for Black lives. And I think just lastly, really asking folks to figure out what's happening locally wherever you are and how it is that you can best show up. Whether that's donating, whether that's coming out to events, whether that's figuring out how you can be part of a peacekeeping team, how to put your body on the line between protesters and police, or whatever that looks like. But I'm excited by the ways that we are constantly figuring out how we actually put our bodies in solidarity and on the line with the movement for Black lives and with Black organizers.
Thanks, Sasha. And I'm going to end with you, Chirag.
Yeah, so I'm really inspired and excited to see that small communities across the United States is coming together to support Black Lives Matter, or Black Lives Matter support us, coming together as a one. But I wanted to also point out that the first generation Desi people also, we come here to build a new life, right? But we need to invest for our children.
Mm-hmm.
So get out there and support whatever the organization locally you have, which will build up to a bigger objective at the national level. Thank you.
Thank you, Chirag. Thank you for reminding us of the hopes and dreams that your family, first-generation Desi immigrants, and really all folks are really only pursuing, right? Which is a better future for their families and for their children and for their communities. And with that, I want to turn it over. Well, actually, I want to end today's Google Hangout unless there are any other closing messages from our friends at 18 Million and Rising, and to just reiterate that SALT is committed to making sure that we can continue to provide updates and really uplift the voices of local communities, as Chirag put it, and as Bhavani Aunty put it, from our communities nationwide, to make sure that we can build the right future, for our children, for our families, for our nation, not only in our communities, but with communities at large. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the folks at 18 Million and Rising to end the call. All right, so it looks like, go for it, Diane.
All right, thanks everyone for signing on. If you missed our video, if you want to catch some clips of the video, you can find it on our YouTube channel, and also definitely check out the Twitter discussion online. Thank you everyone for participating, especially folks who took the time out to make it on the call today. We hope to continue this conversation, and we're thinking of having a couple of series of conversations like this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Stay tuned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye.